Hi everyone, the 0.2 Path of Exile 2 update is just around the corner. We had a big reveal the other day and a lot of people are excited for the Huntress, including myself. I've been waiting for this one for years basically, and it's finally coming. I gotta say, it does look amazing, but I do want to take a deeper look at the ascendancies that I have previewed, the Ritualist and the Amazon, and talk a little bit about the strengths and the weaknesses and what I expect is going to happen. A lot of people are, for example, very excited about the +1 ring slot that we can get on the Ritualist, which does seem pretty powerful on its own, and depending on certain interactions might be pretty crazy. But it might also be that maybe some people are a little bit too optimistic in my opinion. So I want to go through this and see at what exactly is actually going to happen with those ascendancies outside of, the lack of information that we have currently for the skills themselves. So we don't really know the numbers of the skills of the spear abilities, for example, but just the ascendancies are also a pretty important choice. And you could think about playing a spear character with the new skills, but not choosing the Huntress, for example, if you want to go for another ascendancy. So I went through this here and I prepared like a few things as well to kind of like show off the effects in action a little bit and just talk about my overall opinion. Now, of course, it's not like, 100% min-max here we crafted or something like that, and there might be like some things to discover. But it remains to be seen also maybe how other buffs or nerfs are affecting other ascendancies. But just looking at the stuff that we got here from the preview, there's already a lot to see here. This is the Amazon tree, one of the two ascendancies that is coming with the Huntress release. And then here's the Ritualist as well. So I'm going to start with the Amazon, and then we're going to talk about this one, and I'm also going to talk about the overall picture of what I expect here. There's a lot of pretty interesting new notes that we have seen on these new ascendancies here. There's also like some pretty random stuff and kind of like out there things. For example, as Mary Brew, where a life and mana flask can now actually produce both of the effects at once. I think this is, for example, one of the weaker nodes out there. It's nice to use life flasks and mana flasks a bit more often when you play like a life-based build, and I do expect nerfs to energy shield-based builds and maybe even a buff for life-based builds. But on the other hand, I don't feel this is really going to be something that a lot of people will pick up, even if they play it purely life-based. You can also go for something like an evasion energy shield, a life hybrid, for example, which is something that you can do easily on a ranger. I don't see why not on a Huntress as well. And this is also something that I expect to do when I start on hardcore SSF. So all in all, I gotta say, like, stuff like this is kind of random and not really looking that great, but it could be good under some circumstances where you really need a lot of recovery. So if you don't have any other way to get your life back, especially, then this could be kind of nice. Or potentially, if you really want to go far, you can only go all the way to like Mind Over Matter, and then you have like a much larger like mana recovery option basically by pressing a life flask as well. But I think this is not really something you're going to see. Then you also have Mystic Harvest here, the life leech with elemental damage. Now, so far at least, life leech really doesn't seem like it's doing anything, at least to me. Now, first of all, there is not really that many sources of leech. There's basically only like physical attack damage leech in the game. There might be like some other little things out there, like there's a Blood Mage, for example. I'm not exactly sure how well they are doing with their leech, but I just generally didn't hear much from life leech and being a good thing. And also expect that will continue unless there's a change. It could be that in a patch notes there's a buff to life leech. Maybe the numbers are higher, or maybe they're tweaking the formula or something, but they didn't really mention this. So I also expect Mystic Harvest to not really be great. However, you might actually get to the point where you actually have a lot of damage and you have enough leech, and it could be like a good recovery option. And honestly, if that actually becomes a thing, I would definitely prefer this over like as Mary Brew, where you just like press your flask sometimes. And then it comes the third part of the defensive side of the tree here, which is the Stalking Panther. So this is this here. Evasion rating from equipped helmet, gloves, and boots is doubled, and then the evasion rating from equipped body armor is halved. Now that's kind of an interesting concept. I guess it's also something with what I just mentioned, where you can make like hybrid setups, for example, evasion, energy shield based builds. You can equip like a big ES chest, for example, and then kind of just try to get some evasion from the rest of the gear. I don't think that is really such a crazy node though. So the problem is that, for example, your boots usually don't have a lot of like anything basically, because you have to put movement speed there. You also going to put life there, and then it's like one stat or something where maybe get like a few hundred evasion if you're lucky on a good base, and that's about it. Kind of same story with the gloves, so I'm usually gonna have something like life, maybe something like extra physical damage to attacks, and then there's like maybe one more mod or something. And then there's like the helmet, where I'd say, okay, this is maybe a good slot where I can stack up a little bit of like big evasion. So overall, I'm not really that impressed with this node. If you equip like an evasion chest, this is a huge downside, or even with like a hybrid evasion energy shield chest, it's probably not really going to do that much. And overall, this looks a little bit undertuned, but who knows? There might be like some pieces out there that really have like a lot of it that can kind of just like solo carry your entire, evasion needs, for example, on like a helm slot. So maybe you can try to really invest into that. And it could overall increase your survivability a bit, especially if you go for like, let's say, a big energy shield chest. Now let's move on to the more interesting parts here, the offensive side. So basically all these left paths here, there's like a total of 6 nodes that have different themes. And this is actually where it gets pretty interesting. So let's start with those critical strike and penetrate nodes down here. So the critical strike one is pretty interesting and something that we haven't really seen before. It says chance to hit with attacks can exceed 100%, and you gain additional crit chance equal to 25% of excess chance to hit with attacks. Now this is probably something that sounds pretty cryptic and a lot of people don't really understand what is going to happen here. And it's also a bit of an unknown of what is the exact mechanic behind this, but I will give my best guess and show you a little bit what this means. So first of all, you need to know that in order to scale your chance to hit, you need accuracy. Now, as a dex-based character, you're usually going to have a lot of accuracy because dex gives you a lot. So every point of dex is like 5 accuracy, and like a typical, ranger character, for example, like I checked mine in-game, we'll probably end up with somewhere like 3, 4, 5k accuracy, depending on how much dex you have, and maybe like an accuracy roll somewhere. And this usually ensures that you hit like enough chance to hit so that even at a long distance, you will have a good chance to hit, or 100% even. There's actually a formula here, this is from the PoE2 wiki, that explains exactly how this works, and we have this here. So there's the uncapped chance to hit formula that says this number here basically. So you have to stack your accuracy versus the defender's evasion, and then there's also these like static multipliers here that altogether make up the chance to hit. And I tried this math out, and it actually checks out exactly with what I see in game. So without really overdoing it right now, just to get a bit of an idea, we can do some example calculations. And I also have the PoE2DB monster stats page here that is quite interesting because of the evasion rating that monsters have. And it turns out it's actually not really all that high. So I found this page here that kind of shows the base stats per monster level, so to say. So we have like on the left column, there's like the monster level, and then there's the damage, and then there's the evasion column. So we're looking at the first and the third column here when we scroll down. So let's go down here to, let's say, monster level 80, which is like tier 16 maps, I think. And here we end up with 644 evasion as the baseline for monsters. And there's also like even higher maps, so we can go to something like 700 or so evasion on the monsters on the absolute highest tier maps. Now, of course, there might be certain monster types that have extra evasion. There's also elites that have extra evasion, so this doesn't always exactly apply. And I'm not 100% sure if there's maybe some other modifiers involved here, but at least this seems like this is what monsters usually have. And this also seems to check out with the numbers that I've tried on my own character in-game. We can also look at, for example, bosses. So this is Arbiter of Ash. This is like the biggest boss out there, basically. And it also seems like they have pretty comparable evasion rating here. So 644, this is exactly like the tier 80 or like monster level 80 value that we just saw. So it seems like bosses are not really a special case. At least this one, I didn't really go through like the entire list. So if you look at this here, what does it mean? Well, we just start making this calculation and we see what the chance to hit will say. So if we go, for example, for let's say 3000 accuracy rating, so we do 3000, we're doing this like a top line first, so times 1.5 times 100, we get this number. And then we divide this by the sum of the accuracy and the defender's evasion. In this case, 3000 plus, let's say, 700 to round it out. So we divide it by this number, and then we get 121% chance to hit. Now, what this means for the Huntress node here is that everything that goes above 100% will count for the critical strike node, and you get 25% of that as extra crit. So in our example here, we have 21.6%, let's say 22% extra. So a quarter of that is like 5.2 or something % extra crit, with around 3000 accuracy against kind of like the highest level monsters out there. So we easily hit, but we don't really get all that much from this crit node here. And now we have to think about, okay, how will this actually work? Now, building crit chance to the point where you get close to 100%, for example, is pretty tough. Spell builds can do that somewhat easily, I guess, depending on the spell, because some of them have pretty high base crit values. You also have the Blood Mage that can scale crit a lot. There's also stuff like Eye of Winter that can scale crit. So there are a few things that help you to get to 100% crit. But in this case here, if you get like a flat added like around 5% crit for having this kind of accuracy, I would say this is a very weak ascendancy node. And my guess is that this is actually base crit, which means it's the same as, for example, the base crit on your weapon that has usually something like 5, 6, 7% or something like that, so that you can actually scale this up and it doesn't just like, you know, add 5% at the end after you have already scaled your base crit with increases to crit chance and so on. So for example, when you have like a decked out character that takes some of the crit nodes on the passive tree, you'll probably end up with something like 200 to 300% increased crit chance, maybe a bit more on the higher end, so that basically this 5% crit that I just mentioned would become something like triple or quadruple that value, so something like 15 or 20% crit. And that is with a pretty moderate amount of around 3000 accuracy, which you will easily reach on a dex-based character. So that would actually be pretty solid if it works that way. Now, we don't have the confirmation just yet, but in that case, if you want to scale crit, you can actually do this relatively easily, I feel. And you can build into more accuracy in order to get even more out of this. However, the thing is that thanks to this calculation and how it works, you will never really get that crazy amounts from it beyond what I just described. So you can stack a bit more accuracy, but it will kind of like very quickly flatten out the curve. So it kind of like goes like this, and then it goes like asymptotic to a value around at 150. So this means that maybe you can get like double the bonus of what I just said. We can try this out, for example, if we do the same calculation and we say we have double the accuracy. So we go with 6000 accuracy instead of 3000 times 1.5 times 100, and then divide this by 6700. We get to 134% chance to hit. So doubling our accuracy does not actually double our overcapped chance to hit. So we went from 22% to 34%. And then if you add even more, let's say we do like 10,000 accuracy, it looks like this here. So I have this number and then divide by 10,700. We go to like 140, and 10,000 accuracy is a lot of accuracy. So you have to really try. This is getting to the point where this is just not really worth it to stack even more. And I don't think this will really be such a crazy change in how you gear your character. You'll probably try to overcap a little bit, as I just shown you, for example, around the range of like 3,000 to 4,000, maybe 5,000 accuracy or so, depending on what's available to you. You can invest into a few nodes as well on the passive tree, for example. But I don't think you're really going to go beyond that, which means that our overcapped crit is going to be somewhere in the range of like probably 25 to 30%. A quarter of that, yeah, something like 6, 7%, maybe base crit. But it's not even confirmed it's base crit. Either way, the bottom line is I think this is a relatively good node, but it does require you to build into crit chance and crit damage, and you can't really get around that. Now let's talk about penetrate here. This is also a pretty interesting one, and I also have a few examples here. So penetrate says attacks using your weapons have added physical damage equal to 25% of the accuracy rating on the weapon. That's kind of interesting because usually accuracy is kind of like the one thing you want to avoid having on a weapon. Most weapons should look something like flat fizz, percent fizz, and then hybrid percent fizz with accuracy. So that's usually the dream weapon when it comes to like attack builds. And there may be other cases where maybe you want to stack like an elemental thing or something like that. But here it actually gives you a real value for having accuracy on your weapon. And I can tell you, after playing 600 hours of SSF only in this game, well, you do exalt slam those accuracy rolls very often on your weapon. It's actually a pretty common mod. And like this, I imagine we can actually get a lot of value out of this to especially gear up more easily in SSF. And even in some weapon types, there might be a reason to go for accuracy over, for example, the hybrid roll or something like that. So I prepared a few examples here the other day and kind of just looked at what this would look like, what we kind of want to go for. And it does depend a bit on the weapon type that you're using. So for example, here's like a dual string bow that has like a juicy, I think I made them all tier 2 mods, or like the second best basically. So like 160% fizz, and then like a tier 2 flat fizz, and then a juicy accuracy. And here also the accuracy rating runes. There's also runes that can do that. Usually would put like iron runes, but this would also feed into this new ascendancy node. So you have to remember, you get a quarter of the accuracy rating on the weapon as extra added physical damage. Now this damage will probably just be added to like the total of the calculation. It will probably not be added to the damage of the weapon itself, and then you multiply that with the percent increase physical on it or something like that. So I expect this is kind of like similar to how like a ring roll works, where you just have like an extra flat added value at the end. But in this example here, with like a 500 accuracy roll and 2 runes, we can see this is 700 accuracy you can get here. And 700 accuracy, well, that is a lot of extra physical damage. So in our case here, for example, this damage per hit on this weapon is 184 plus 330 divided by 2. This is the average, 257 damage per shot. And then we get a quarter of 700. So in that case, we would add plus 175, and that's the total damage done. Now, of course, there could be like, other rolls out there with like rings and so on. So you maybe have like plus 20 here, plus 20 there. So maybe you do have something like this. And then the overall output is somewhere in the range of like 500 per shot. And now let's try the same again, but we change those 2 rolls here to what we would normally have as like our dream weapon, which is the hybrid increased fizz and 200 accuracy. So we're gonna also lower this mod here to a little bit of a lower value. So let's say like, we do like 70 here. And then this is also kind of like the same level of perfection of what we just saw. And then we do iron runes here. And then this weapon will look a little bit different. So now we have 257 to 460. Our average damage is 358 from this weapon. And now we have a lot less accuracy here. So in this case, basically only the 168. So we take a quarter of that, which is 42. And then we just added 3 rings earlier, where we said, ring, ring, and glove. So we do like 20, 20, 20, and our total is 460. And this is, so if we look at the total outcome out of this, then we see that the accuracy stacking bow is actually somewhere in the range of around 10% stronger, at least at those values. Now, of course, this will really depend on how much accuracy you actually have on a weapon, how good is your weapon, what kind of gear you have in general. But you can see that this node here could actually be pretty impactful, and it does follow the overall theme of like ascendancy nodes giving you something like 10 to 15% extra power. So the other value was like close to 500, which kind of checks out here. Again, it will really depend on the exact weapon that you have, and you will also always have to check that in like Path of Building, for example, to really see the effect. But I did notice that, for example, for the slower and hard-hitting weapons, it is usually more beneficial to stack the damage itself and not go for that ascendancy node. So, for example, if you were to play a Huntress or like an Amazon with the 200 mace, the fist values and everything is like so high that you can't really get enough accuracy to make up for that. So you really want to go for like the all-in on damage on these bigger hitting weapons, and then the faster and the smaller the weapons are, the more this accuracy can actually play a role. And this also means that, for example, for spears, I expect them to have relatively low damage, relatively fast attack speed. And this means that this accuracy stacking might actually be a real option here, where you have a weapon like this. So that I just made a mace now because that's what we got. And you do like, one big flat fizz roll, one big percent roll, and then you do a big accuracy roll and even accuracy runes. So depending on just exactly how the spears will turn out, this might actually be the way to go. And considering that spears do seem like, very fast weapons, and Huntress is fast, this might actually play out really in favor of using something like this penetrate node here in order to scale up your damage. Especially on the SSF side of things, I could imagine that this just opens up so many more possible options for choosing a weapon. Although you do also have to consider this takes 2 ascendancy points. So you actually have to invest into this node in order to, then have the weapon with the accuracy and then get something out of it. So it is a bit of a struggle, and you have to like min-max a bit and so on. But I do think this could be a really powerful node with the right weapon. And there could even be like some unique stuff out there where you have like a unique weapon that maybe comes with a lot of accuracy, for example, but not really high base damage. I didn't really check the entire list now, but maybe something like that exists or might exist. And this could maybe also like supercharge this node, for example. Now let's talk about some of the other nodes here. So the middle path is a very interesting one, which has Predatory Instinct with the reveal weaknesses and then the follow-up node in for the kill that scales of that as well. So let's talk about those here. This is this one first, Predatory Instinct, which says you reveal weaknesses against rare and unique enemies and 50% more damage done against enemies with an open weakness. So if you don't really know what this looks like, we actually have an example here, and this is this here. So you see these really weird kind of like brighter parts of the health bar on this boss here. So these are the weaknesses, and it looks like this overall like a weakness meter is exactly half of the total health bar. And it might shift kind of like where it is exactly, but it means that for around half of the HP of the enemy, you have a 50% extra bonus. Now, this doesn't equal a 25% more multiplier exactly, because you also have to consider that this part of the HP will disappear more quickly because you deal more damage during that window. Now, let's assume an example with uniform DPS. We have 1 damage per second against a target with 100 life, so it will take 100 seconds to finish the fight. Now, half of that you will do 50% extra. So in that case, we take 50 and divide it by 1.5, meaning that this part of the weaknesses is completed in 33 seconds and not in 50 seconds like it normally would. And then we just simply add the remaining parts where you don't have any bonus, and the total outcome would be 83 seconds instead of what would normally be 100 seconds. And this means if we divide 100 by this value that we just got, we would end up with a 20% increase in our damage output. So this is the actual value of this node. You don't get 25% because some people might jump to a conclusion, yeah, 50% bonus, it's up half the time, but that's not actually true because it's not up half the time. It's up for less because it disappears faster. But on the other hand, you could also try to, for example, make use of this mechanic by having some really hard-hitting abilities and use them exactly in the right moment. So if you are managing to time this a little bit with some big combos, like imagine something like Hammer of the Gods, for example, not a very like Huntress-like ability, but let's just look at the example. You could drop the Hammer of the Gods right at the end of this weakness part, for example, and you could get a lot of extra damage before that, slowly using up this weakness. And then, right in the end, you can kind of like, drop the hammer, kaboom, and like the entire hammer is going to be buffed, even though there's barely any weakness left. So you can maybe just like one-tap the boss from there or something like that. So if you have these kind of tools available to you, where you don't just do uniform DPS, but you actually have like a burst and like a hard-hitting ability especially, this could be really good because then you can get more than this average of 20% damage, which is already pretty good by itself, to be fair. 20% more multiplier on just one Paragon node is extremely good. And it's kind of like an auto pickup, I think, when you play an Amazon, because it just works for everything and you don't really have to worry about it if you don't want to. And sometimes you can try to time something around it. On the other hand, though, it does have the downside. It's only against rares and uniques. So it is overall a pretty strong node, I think. 20% more multiplier as an average is pretty good, but it doesn't really work against everything. But it does work against the stuff that matters the most. We're gonna fight a lot of rare monsters that give you all the juice to loot. There's a lot of focus on bossing. So overall, I think this is very good to pick up, and I would definitely include that in most builds. And then we have the follow-up node here, in for the kill. So 20% increased movement speed when enemy with open weaknesses in your presence, 40% increased skill speed as well. I gotta say, especially considering that this is the follow-up node to what we just kind of established as like a really good first node, I am quite underwhelmed by this one. Because, yeah, it is nice to get this big buff against the rares and so on, and it's good for the boss fights and sometimes. But if you consider that this is up for maybe a third of the time on a boss fight, and then, who knows, maybe like 10% of the time while mapping, or 20% of the time maybe, this is actually extremely weak, I think. If you assume something like 20% uptime, for example, this would mean we have 4% increased movement speed and like 8% increased skill speed, as an average, for example. So this looks extremely weak to me. And even on the boss where this is up, let's say, the third of the time or maybe a bit more, yeah, we would look at something like 7% movement speed, 15% skill speed. Yeah, it is something, I guess. And if you really don't know what to do with your points, you can take it. But considering how nice this weakness stuff is, I feel like this is like a very underwhelming follow-up here, and I would probably only take it if I really don't know what else to go for. Now, lastly, let's talk about the elemental side. So there's like the top path here on the left that has the infusions. So you get like a new skill called Infuse Weapon. Now we do have a screenshot of that somewhere that shows us what this does roughly. So this is here on the top right, the infused weapon, and basically when you throw your spear, it will become infused and then it will explode at the end of the path. So I'm not 100% sure how this will work with, some of the kind of like, just kind of like long range spear throw projectiles, but there's a bunch of them that actually just land in the ground at a targeted location, for example, or they land in an enemy and then they go boom. So I guess this will work a little bit different depending on the skill that you use, but this is what we got here. And we can see that this number on the skill is actually extremely high. 612% attack damage is very high. This is almost comparable to like a perfect strike hit, for example, with fully charged up. This is a really good value. And then it converts 100% of physical to the elements and gives you like a pretty decent explosion radius as well. So I think this infusion stuff, if you can generate a lot of charges, is actually going to be very good. You just need to be able to actually produce those charges. Now there is one really good way of producing charges. I've actually done this on like one of my builds, which is Combat Frenzy. So this is a spirit gem here that says when you freeze, electrocute, or pin an enemy, you gain a frenzy charge. And like this, you can either go for frenzy charges, or you can also go for the Resonance Keystone, which is somewhere up here. For example, monks do that quite often with, like, I've done that with Ice Strike Monk with the charged stuff. And I was producing power charges because the quarter stuffs really like power charges. And you just convert them basically. So you can use Counter Frenzy for either of those two. Endurance charges is a bit more tricky, I guess, but it also gives you fire, which is probably the least desired element anyway. So you don't really care too much, I think. And in that case, you can probably produce these infusions relatively often, especially if you play like a cold build that freezes stuff all the time, or maybe go for some electrocute stuff. There is like ways to get electrocute. Or if you do like, let's say, a physical build and you actually pin enemies a lot. Pinning is very easy. It has a very fast build up. You can also invest into that. You can constantly generate those charges very easily by having some pin in your build. And then you can get either this frenzy or power charges. So I expect that we're actually going to see people kind of like just permanently throwing those infused weapons, giving those 600% damage explosions everywhere, basically on every single throw while mapping. It might kind of scale down on the bosses, but maybe if you have like a setup that is good for bossing anyway, it might be fine. So it depends a bit on the skills that you're actually using. But overall, I think this elemental infusion does look pretty juicy. And then there's also the follow-up note here where you have a 50% chance to not be consumed when infusing a projectile. So this effectively doubles the amount of infusions as an average. So instead of 2 uses, you get 4 every time that you consume a frenzy charge, for example. So I'm not really sure how you would consume power charges right now on this class because, yeah, this depends a little bit on the skills they can use. But it does seem like basically all of the ranged thrown attacks can consume frenzy charges, or at least that's something they said. So I think it's going to be very easy to consume frenzies and also generate them. So as long as you do that, you're going to be golden, I think. And that also pretty much sums it up now for the Amazon, which is probably like the more complicated one here. But I do think there is a lot of really good stuff out there. Personally, I'm not impressed really by the right side at all with like the defensive and the recovery side of things. But I think on the left side, there's a lot of really good stuff and really interesting stuff that they've added here on the Huntress. And I do expect it's going to be pretty powerful with the right combos. There's infusion stuff could go really crazy. And then we have like the weakness stuff here, which is especially for skilled players and for like the right setups, like what I described, where you have like a big burst or something in the right moment. This could be really huge as well. And even for builds that kind of just like, whack away with like small attacks, this is going to be a pretty good pickup. And then we have the critical strike stuff. So this is actually like a pretty big enabler as well, especially if this works as a base crit, which I do expect. Then this could actually really allow you to scale your crit pretty close to 100% or even get there entirely and then have like a real crit build. So that could be pretty exciting. Now let's talk about the Ritualist. This is the second ascendancy coming from the Huntress for the 3 that we're going to have eventually. We don't have the third one now with the release, but a lot of people are really excited about this one, mostly because of the +1 ring slot, which is, well, I might be hiding this right now with the camera, but it's like here on the far bottom left, it just says +1 ring slot, and it goes here. This is this node. So this is kind of like the big kicker of this ascendancy, and then it's a bunch of other small stuff. And now we have to figure out how big is an extra ring slot actually, and also how important is this Mystic Attunement node here with the 25% increased bonuses gained from equipped rings and amulets, which is obviously an auto pickup right after that as well. A lot of people talk about Ingenuity, for example, being like, a really strong item. So if you go for that and you have like, many rings equipped and then you buff them with Ingenuity, yeah, that could be pretty cracked. I don't know if they're going to nerf this belt or if there's going to be some other mechanic kind of like preventing this from being super ridiculous. I do think so though, because it did sound like on the like official live reveal that this ring would be treated a little bit different from normal rings. So I actually expect that Ingenuity is not going to interact with this, and maybe there's going to be maybe some new tag or some new kind of keyword or something that specifies that Ingenuity only works for 2 normal rings, for example. And this extra ring is not actually a normal ring, because there would be some other really weird and complicated interactions that would come out of this. Another one is, for example, the calendar ring. It's this one here where it reflects your other ring, but you have 2 other rings. So which one is going to be reflected, or both of them reflected? There's going to be some kind of weird stuff like that as well. And this is also why I believe that this extra ring slot will allow you to put a ring there, but it will not be affected by stuff like this or Ingenuity. So this is currently my expectation. And as I mentioned on the live reveal, they did say that this extra ring would be carried on like a chain around your neck or something like that. So it's not actually on your hand, and this would kind of give them like a lore argument, let's say, to make this work differently. So this might be a ring slot in an emerald slot that is not actually affected by this kind of stuff. So this is kind of what I expect. Besides, of course, Mystic Attunement, which works for everything, rings and amulets. So effectively what this means, let's say if we assume, which is a bit unfair, but if we assume that you have normally 2 rings and an amulet and they're all kind of similar value, then it would go from 3 total slots to 4 total slots by having an extra ring. Let's leave out Ingenuity and so on. So you have 4 total items basically, you get 1 extra ring. And this is kind of the value you get from this 1 ring slot. There's also like this downside here that you have to deal with. There's reduced spirit and reduced mana and reduced elemental res, which is like the small nodes. You have to choose one of them as like a downside for this gain, which is probably fine. You can probably work around this with most builds relatively easily. It is a bit of a downside, but nothing really to worry about too much, I feel. Especially on attack-based builds, I feel like the mana, for example, might not be such a big deal. And then we have this node here, the Mystic Attunement. So if you assume that we have 4 somewhat similar value items equipped with 3 rings and 1 amulet, we get 25% bonus to all of them, which means that we go from 4 to 5 items, basically. So this is kind of like the value that you get out of the Ritualist here. You get the +1 and then kind of another +1 from the all combined, bonuses, basically. Now, I do acknowledge that amulets are probably more valuable than rings in most cases, just because you can have stuff like skill ranks on them and, stuff like crit and whatnot. So there's like more stats that open up here on the amulets. I would say they're overall probably more important, and this is not super fair what I just said, but it's kind of gives us an idea at least of the value of this node. And so to get back to like one of our examples here, this is just something that I have on my planner here. This is like really juicy, like basically perfect rolls or something on a ring. So especially on the high end of things, I guess this could scale up quite a lot with like the extra value you can gain from having an extra ring equipped like this. Look at those stats. For example, you can get like 140 life on a typical life-based build on a ranger. This is probably like an increase of like 5% or something of your total. So that's quite an improvement, to be honest. Then you can have like a bunch of flat damage here. So we had the example earlier with the bow where we ended up at like around 500 damage per shot. So let's say we have like a 20 physical damage to attack roll. You can get another one, and then it's also buffed a little bit. You can actually get 2 of them. So you could get something like 8 to 10% damage from just like this physical damage to attacks roll, on top of the around 5% or so extra survivability. And then you still have room for some extra stats here. You can put rarity, res, mana, whatever on the suffixes, maybe stacking some decks and whatnot. And you also have the implicit of the ring itself that is also playing a role here. So overall, it does look like those extra rings could be relatively impactful and actually make up for how bad the ascendancy is otherwise, to be honest. So again, it will depend exactly on what is available to you, what are the stats you already have, but just to kind of give a bit of a ballpark number, I guess a ring could easily be something like 5 to 10% DPS and around 4 to 6% toughness, plus then give you like all this other stuff like res and attributes and so on. I think especially for attribute stacking builds, this could be huge because you actually have the option to put a lot of them on rings. So you can, just like, fill up the suffixes and go like, strength, all attributes, stacks, whatever. And really, go to the moon with stuff like Hoa, for example. Now, we do expect Hoa will get nerfed, but this would be one of those cases, I think, where those extra rings can really make a difference because you can't really put those attributes on that many other pieces. And another thing to consider is also that this extra ring slot, even if it is not buffed by stuff like ingenuity, let's say, that's likely to happen, I guess, you could use this for a unique ring. So there are a bunch of pretty good unique rings that some builds want out there. And you can just put that in the extra ring slot and then still run an ingenuity, for example, and get the full value of like 2 yellow rings or something like that. And then you could actually get some pretty interesting stuff going. So in addition to what I just said about like the average value of like a yellow ring, you can also potentially get even more out of it by having this extra ring slot and then using, some rings that just don't really have great stats. Something like Pole Circle, for example. It's a very powerful ring for like, Herald of Ice builds and cold attack builds, for example. You can do like insane shatter combos with this. And this was really powerful, at least in patch 0.1. And just putting this in the extra ring slot and then still buffing your other 2 rings with an ingenuity, for example, could be wild. So this is really what I expect to be like the big value here for the Ritualist. You do get a lot of value from attribute stacking on the rings or from having like a unique ring and then still having 2 really good other rings, for example. So this is really what makes the Ritualist what it is. And again, it depends on the exact items that you're going for. But then we also come to the problem that there is literally nothing else on the Ascendancy that really looks exciting, I gotta say. So let's look at this here. We have like the charm track as well. So GG did say that they want to make charms more important, and they're like introducing some unique charms, and they're like buffing monster CC, and that everyone will cry about, and maybe gonna nerf it again. So realistically, I don't really expect much from those charms, is what I'm saying. And there's also like a chance to like consume your mana instead of the charm charges to trigger them. I only really see this useful as something for like, triple rarity charms if you really want to like blast and like, choose up maps or something. This is really it, I think, because otherwise, I don't know what we're going to see here. I don't expect you're going to trigger our charms that often. How often are you getting frozen or stunned or ignited or something like that? It just doesn't really happen often enough. And even if it did, it would consume your mana pretty fast all the time. So I don't know about that. And then we have like this ritual sacrifice here. So this is something that I've also previewed. The way this works is that you walk up to the corpse of a dead rare enemy, and then you stick your dagger in there, you wait like 3 seconds or something, and then you get those modifiers for like 20 seconds or so. It's like basically like a headhunter style effect where you steal the affixes from the corpse, which could be kind of fun. It has a really good flavor, but it does seem like very slow and clunky, and it's also extremely unreliable. So I don't know exactly how good this node is, but it does seem like it's more of like a, kind of funny little thing to me. Then it will really be like a reliable power-up, let's say, for your setup. And then there's also the other option here to kind of like get a modifier by sacrificing your life, like 20% of your life, to get one of them. There might be like a certain list of certain modifiers that can only get this way, for example, because there's a tooltip here that we don't see. So maybe it actually lists out some things and it's like a smaller pool or so. But if this just gives you like one random thing for I think like 20 or 30 seconds or so, you have to give up 20% of your life, you have to regen that back. It does seem pretty awful to me, honestly, even if you can do it without a corpse. Yeah, so overall, ritual sacrifice, yeah, it's kind of like funny and good for mapping maybe, but for example in boss fights you just don't have any corpses. You can't do it even, so you kind of just have like this entire ascendancy track there, like not really used in some cases, and then you only have this here, which might even be something that is not even that valuable. And lastly, we have 2 more nodes here. So there's the Wildwood Persistence, 5% increased life recovery rate per 5% missing life. I'm not really that impressed by this, to be honest. if you want to get life regen, you can play warrior with the new ascendancy and get tons of life regen or something. I'm not really sure what you're trying here. Like, maybe we could go for some kind of like weird low life builds. I feel like there's not really enough support to really have like a build where you stay at low life, you know, stuff like Petrified Blood in PoE 1 or something, or endurance mechanic from last Epoch. This stuff is like somewhat missing in PoE 2 and makes using this node here not really that easy, I think. So right now, I'm not really sure. There might be some wild combo out there where you really want to like regen back a lot of life all the time or something, or leech it back. But realistically, this seems kind of weak. And then we have Corrupted Life Force, which is also a new ability here, Blood Boil. And it also doesn't impress me that much. So we have the tooltip here. Basically, it applies corrupted blood when you kill enemies. There will be like these blood boils. Depending on how long they were in your presence, the longer you fight them, the more of these blood boils stack up. And then you have like a bigger effect, basically. And you can kind of overlap those a little bit. Corrupted blood usually stacks to 10 times. So let's say you have like a pack of enemies. There's 10 white monsters and 1 rare monster. So you explode all these white monsters around the rare, and then it will tick for 20% of the slain enemy's maximum life as physical damage per second. And if that is the case with just like, normal trash versus the rare will have a lot more HP. So this extra like dot that comes from the corrupted blood wouldn't really do all that much, I believe, unless you kill some really big trash monsters. Overall, I guess it remains to be seen. It could be a good way for some bleed builds or something that scale like physical damage over time or something like that to like maybe boost this a little bit and get more out of it. It is certainly like some pretty interesting interaction here, and there might be something with this, but I don't really believe too much in it. I think it's like a kind of slow mechanic, and well, the game is somewhat slow and maybe gonna get slower in 0.2. But I think that this might be too slow to really feel good. But maybe for some builds that actually have relatively small AoE coverage, that could help them to actually clear packs a little bit more easily. So if you really scale this up and then like kill 2-3 guys in a pack or something, and then everything kind of starts melting because it goes based off the HP of the enemy. And we know, for example, from Detonate Dead, that this can be pretty impactful. So if you have a kind of like HP scaling mechanic like this, there's always some room for it. So while right now I'm not super impressed, I do believe we're gonna see this in action, and it might be pretty good in certain setups. And that also concludes the Ascendancy breakdown for the Huntress so far. So right now I'm not actually really sure which one I want to start with. I gotta say, I am leaning towards Amazon. Just because I think there's a lot of really cool and interesting stuff. I want to try these infusions, for example, and maybe see what you can do with those weaknesses and maybe even the crit stuff. So I think there's like a lot of versatility here on the Amazon, and this looks like a pretty good Ascendancy. But I might also consider playing something like a Ranger, for example, or even the new Warrior, and then just go for Spears. So I haven't really like made the passive tree yet, or so we'll wait till the patch notes and see what happens. And then I might just play like a Spear character, but not as a Huntress. But we'll see. Maybe I'll go for this. Maybe I'll go for the Ritualist. I think there's definitely compelling reasons to go for either of them. And it seems like there is a lot of really cool mechanics to play around with on these new Ascendancies. And that's about it. So let me know what you think, or what you have been theory crafting and planning already, or if I missed something really obvious, maybe with, how valuable is the extra ring slot or whatnot. Let me know. I'll be kind of curious to see. But for now, I gotta say, I'm hyped. I'm pumped for this patch. I'm excited to log in on Huntress on Friday. So hope you're gonna be with me, and I'll see you guys next time.